caused your last breakup? Story 1. We were together for almost 3 years and everything seemed fine. We had our ups and downs like any couple, but we always worked through them. But then, one day, I noticed that he had started acting distant. He'd be glued to his phone all the time, and when I'd ask what was going on, he'd just brush it off or change the subject. I started feeling like something was off, but I didn't want to jump to conclusions. One day, I found out what was really going on. I was cleaning around his things when I found a message on his phone from a girl he'd been talking to for weeks. It wasn't just friendly small talk. It was flirtatious and intimate. My heart sank. I confronted him, and he admitted that he had been emotionally involved with this girl for a while. He said it wasn't physical, but that didn't matter to me. The trust was broken, and I knew I couldn't go back to how things were. The worst part? He didn't even seem genuinely sorry. He apologized, but his actions didn't match his words. I couldn't stay with someone who didn't value me enough to be open and honest. So, we ended it. I'll never forget that feeling of betrayal, and I'm still healing from it. I think the hardest part was realizing that maybe I didn't really know him as well as I thought. Story 2. The breakup wasn't sudden. It was a slow unraveling. We had been together for 2 years, and at first it was amazing. But as time passed, I started noticing little things. He was always the one making the decisions, even when it came to things that affected both of us. It started with him picking the movies we watched. Then it escalated to him deciding where we'd eat, what we'd do on weekends, and even who I could hang out with. At first, I thought it was just him being protective, or maybe he just had strong opinions. But over time, it started to feel like control. When I tried to express my thoughts or voice my opinions, he'd get irritated or make me feel like I was overreacting. I started doubting myself, and it became exhausting trying to constantly fight for my voice to be heard. I tried talking to him about it, and while he'd agree that he didn't want to control me, nothing changed. The final straw was when I made plans to go out with some friends, and he threw a tantrum about it, accusing me of not caring about our relationship. That was when I realized that this wasn't healthy. I couldn't keep living like this, constantly walking on eggshells. So, I left. It was the hardest decision I've ever made, but I knew it was the right one. Story 3. Our relationship ended because I realized I was the only one putting in effort. I had always been the one initiating plans, reaching out to make sure everything was okay, and compromising on what I wanted to make things work. For months, I tried to ignore the signs that he wasn't as invested as I was. He'd cancel plans last minute, forget important events in my life, and barely communicate when we were apart. But I kept making excuses for him because I loved him and wanted it to work. One day, I sat down and had a heart-to-heart with him. I asked if he was still interested in the relationship because it felt like I was the only one trying. He said that he was just too busy and didn't have the energy for anything extra, but to me, it felt like an excuse. He never made time for us, and I was always left feeling lonely, even when we were together. I realized then that I couldn't keep carrying the relationship on my own. It wasn't fair to me. I wasn't asking for perfection, just some effort, but it wasn't something he was willing to give. So, I made the painful decision to break up. I cried a lot because I still loved him, but I knew that I deserved more than someone who didn't care enough to meet me halfway. Story 4. It wasn't something dramatic that caused our breakup, but rather a growing realization that we had outgrown each other. When we first got together, we were both young, energetic, and excited about life. We spent hours talking about our dreams and building plans for the future, but over the years, our paths started to diverge. She wanted to settle down, get a house, and have kids. I was focused on my career and personal growth. We didn't fight or argue, but we had different priorities, and it became clear that we wanted different things. I could see the frustration in her eyes every time we talked about the future. She wanted to plan for a life together, and I was still figuring out my own. We had tried to make it work, but it became harder and harder to ignore the fact that we were heading in opposite directions. The last conversation we had before breaking up was calm, but it was filled with the understanding that neither of us was happy, and we still cared about each other, but we both knew we needed different things in life. It was mutual, and while it wasn't easy, it was the right decision. We just weren't the right people for each other anymore. Story 5. It was my trust issues that led to our breakup. I'll admit it. I had baggage from past relationships, and I didn't know how to deal with it. When we started dating, everything seemed great, but my insecurity and jealousy began to show. I'd question him about where he was, who he was with, and why he hadn't texted me back right away. He never gave me a reason to doubt him, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was hiding something. At first, he was patient, trying to reassure me that I had nothing to worry about. But as time went on, my constant questioning started to wear him down. He'd get frustrated, and I could see the toll it was taking on him. I wanted to trust him, but my past kept getting in the way. I hated myself for it, but I couldn't stop the cycle. Eventually, he told me he couldn't do it anymore. He loved me, but he couldn't keep being questioned all the time. He said it wasn't about him. It was about me not dealing with my past. And he was right. I realized that my insecurities had ruined something good. We ended things, and I spent a lot of time reflecting on my behavior. I'm still working on healing, and while it was painful to let him go, I understand now that I needed to fix myself before I could truly be in a healthy relationship. Story 6. I think the moment I realized our relationship was over was when I stopped feeling like a priority. We had been dating for almost 2 years, and at first, everything was perfect. He was kind, funny, and he always seemed to make time for me, even in the midst of his busy schedule. But slowly, things changed. It wasn't sudden, and I didn't notice it at first, but after a while it became clear I wasn't important to him anymore. He would cancel our plans at the last minute, constantly say he was too busy to spend time with me, and whenever we did talk, it felt forced. I started feeling like I was more of a nuisance than a partner. At first, I tried to talk to him about it. I asked why he was pulling away and if everything was okay. He would always reassure me that it wasn't anything personal and that work was just stressful, or he was dealing with other issues. I wanted to believe him, but the truth was, I felt like I was constantly chasing after him for attention and affection. Then came the straw that broke the camel's back. We had made plans to go out for a special date night, something we hadn't done in weeks. I had even picked out an outfit I knew he'd love. But as the day went on, he didn't respond to my texts, and by the time we were supposed to meet, I had still heard nothing. I called him, and when he finally picked up, he casually told me that he had forgotten about our plans and made other arrangements with his friends instead. I couldn't even be mad. I was just heartbroken. It wasn't the first time he had chosen other people over me, but this time, it hit me differently. I realized that if I wasn't a priority to him, maybe I wasn't meant to be in this relationship, and I ended things that night. It wasn't a dramatic fight or an angry exchange. It was just the painful realization that I deserved more than someone who couldn't even make time for me. It took a long time to heal, but I've learned to put myself first since then. Story 7. I still can't believe it ended the way it did. It was my fault, though. I should have seen it coming, but sometimes when you're in the middle of something, it's hard to notice how unhealthy things have become. We had been together for over 3 years, and it felt like we were a team. He was my best friend, my confidant, and I loved him deeply. But over time, I began to feel like I was the only one putting any effort into our relationship. It started with small things. He would forget our anniversaries, not remember details I'd shared with him, and always make excuses about why he couldn't hang out. I felt like I was doing all the emotional labor, picking up the slack, and doing everything I could to keep things alive. I tried to talk to him about it. At first, he'd promised to do better, and I'd believe him, but nothing ever changed. The more I tried to give, the less I got in return. I became exhausted, emotionally drained, and frustrated. One day, I sat down with him and told him how I felt. I said I was unhappy and that I needed more from the relationship. Instead of listening or showing any willingness to change, he just shrugged it off, as if he wasn't even bothered. He told me I was overreacting and being dramatic. That was the moment I knew it was over. I deserved more than someone who couldn't even make an effort to understand where I was coming from. It wasn't about me asking for grand gestures, just simple things like communication, empathy, and mutual care. When he showed me that he didn't value those things, I realized I was wasting my time. I broke up with him that day. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary for my mental health. Sometimes people just stop trying, and no matter how much you love them, you can't carry the relationship on your own. Story 8. I thought I had everything figured out. We had been together for about a year, and I thought we were on the same page, but boy, was I wrong. Everything seemed to be going well at first, but over time, I noticed his behavior changing in ways I couldn't ignore. He started getting more secretive. His phone was always locked, and whenever I'd ask him what he was up to, his answers were vague or dismissive. I never imagined he was cheating. I trusted him, but something in my gut told me that things weren't right. I didn't want to snoop around or accuse him without evidence, so I tried to ignore it. But then, I found a text message on his phone one night while he was in the shower. It wasn't a friendly chat. It was a flirtatious exchange with another woman. I felt like the floor had been ripped out from under me. I didn't know what to do, so I confronted him about it. He didn't deny it. He admitted he had been seeing someone else for the past few weeks. I was devastated. I had never imagined he'd betray me like that. He apologized, said he didn't mean for it to happen, but that didn't make it hurt any less. What stung even more was the way he acted after the fact. He didn't seem genuinely sorry. It was as if he was more upset about getting caught than about hurting me. I ended it that night. I didn't want to be with someone who couldn't respect me enough to be honest. It took me a long time to heal from the betrayal. But in the end, I realized I was better off without him. I couldn't keep fighting for someone who wasn't even fighting for me. Story 9. I think we were both too stubborn, and that's what killed our relationship. We had been dating for about a year, and we were deeply in love, but we were constantly at odds over the smallest things. It wasn't that we didn't care about each other. In fact, it was the opposite. We cared so much that we'd argue about everything. Who should clean the dishes? Whose turn it was to pick the rest, whether or not we should hang out with friends on weekends. It felt like every time we had a disagreement, it escalated into something bigger. The turning point came when we had a huge fight about something trivial, and I realized we were both being immature. We kept arguing because neither of us was willing to back down. We had stopped compromising, stopped listening to each other, and it felt like we were speaking two different languages. That night, after an argument that lasted hours, we both sat in silence, staring at each other, realizing that we had no idea how to communicate anymore. I knew then that we needed a break. We had lost the connection we once had, and neither of us could remember why we started fighting in the first place. I broke up with him that evening, not because I didn't love him, but because I knew that love wasn't enough if we couldn't figure out how to be a team. We both needed time to grow individually, and maybe someday we would be better for each other. But in that moment, we were just two people who couldn't find common ground anymore. Story 10. Sometimes, I wonder if things would have been different if I had noticed the red flags earlier. Our relationship had always been passionate, and in the beginning, I thought it was a sign of how much we cared about each other. But as time went on, the passion turned into something else, something toxic. It wasn't just the constant fighting. It was the manipulation and gaslighting that started to creep in. It all began when he started accusing me of things I hadn't done. He would say I was flirting with other guys, even when I wasn't, or that I didn't care about him as much as he cared about me. At first, I shrugged it off, thinking he was just insecure, but it escalated quickly. Whenever I tried to explain myself or defend my actions, he would turn it around and make me feel like I was the one in the wrong. One day, I realized how much he had manipulated my sense of reality. I had started doubting myself, questioning if I was actually doing things wrong or if I was just overreacting. That's when I knew I had to leave. No matter how much I loved him, no one deserves to be made to feel crazy or manipulated. I walked away from the relationship, even though it hurt like hell. It was the hardest thing I've ever done, but I knew it was the only way to get my life back. Story 11. The end of our relationship wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a big fight or a shocking betrayal. It was the quiet realization that we had grown apart. We had been together for almost 5 years, and at first, it felt like everything was perfect. We had the same sense of humor, similar interests, and we just fit. But over time, I started noticing that the things we used to enjoy together weren't bringing us joy anymore. What used to feel easy started feeling like a chore. At first, I tried to brush it off. Relationships go through phases, I thought. We were just going through a rough patch, but as time went on, it became harder to ignore. We'd spend hours in silence, sitting next to each other but feeling like we were miles apart. Conversations were awkward. We didn't talk about the future like we used to. We didn't make plans. And the spark we once had was just gone. We both knew it, but neither of us wanted to face it. The tipping point came when we went on a weekend getaway that was supposed to rekindle some of the magic. Instead of enjoying each other's company, we spent the entire trip fighting about little things, and it felt like we were both just trying to get through the weekend without saying what we both already knew. We were done. It was a painful realization, but we broke up a week later, knowing that staying together for the sake of comfort wasn't fair to either of us. It wasn't that we didn't care about each other. We did. But we had changed. We had grown in different directions, and that was okay. We just weren't the same people anymore, and staying together out of habit or fear of change wasn't an option. It was a quiet breakup, but it was the right one. Story 12. It wasn't one big event that ended our relationship. It was a culmination of many small things that added up over time. I had been with him for 2 years, and at first, everything seemed perfect. We had so much in common, and I honestly believed we were soulmates. But slowly, his flaws started to become harder to ignore. The first sign that things weren't right came when I realized he wasn't emotionally available. Whenever I tried to open up about my feelings or talk about something important, he would shut down. At first, I thought he just didn't know how to express his emotions, but over time, it became clear that he wasn't interested in learning. He would avoid hard conversations or try to distract me with jokes or petty arguments. I felt like I was carrying the emotional weight of the relationship on my own, and it left me feeling drained. I talked to him about it several times. I told him I needed him to be more present, more engaged. He would promise to try, but nothing ever changed. Slowly, I started to feel more like a caretaker than a partner. I was always trying to patch things up, but I never felt like he was meeting me halfway. The final straw came one evening when we had a serious conversation about our future. He had been distant for weeks and I needed clarity. When I asked him where he saw us in the next few years, he couldn't answer. He seemed almost indifferent to the idea of a future together. That was the moment I realized I couldn't keep holding on to something that wasn't evolving. I deserved someone who was as invested in our future as I was. We broke up that night. It wasn't messy, and there were no harsh words, but it was the hardest decision I've ever made. I loved him, but love wasn't enough if I was the only one trying. Story 13. If you had told me a year ago that I'd be breaking up with him, I wouldn't have believed it. He was my best friend, my confidant, the person I thought I would be with forever. We had been together for 3 years, and I truly believed we had everything figured out. But somewhere along the way, I started feeling like I was living in a relationship where I didn't truly exist. I know that sounds dramatic, but looking back, I realize how much of myself I lost. He was very controlling, and I didn't even notice it at first. He made decisions for me without consulting me, and I let him because I trusted him and thought he knew better. He would make little comments about how I dressed, what I ate, and who I hung out with, and at the time, I thought it was because he cared. But as time went on, it started to feel more like criticism than concern. One day I went out with some friends without checking in with him, and he flipped out. He accused me of being inconsiderate, of not caring about him, and that was when I realized something was wrong. I had been so focused on making him happy that I stopped thinking about what made me happy. I had stopped doing things for myself. I didn't recognize the person I had become, someone who was constantly trying to please him and put his needs above my own. The emotional toll was too much. I had become someone I didn't like, and I was losing my sense of self. I had tried to talk to him about how I felt, but he didn't understand. He dismissed my feelings as being too sensitive. After weeks of debating whether I should stay or leave, I chose to walk away. It was terrifying because I was afraid of being alone. But deep down, I knew I couldn't keep sacrificing my happiness for someone who didn't understand or respect my boundaries. The relationship was toxic, and leaving was the hardest but best decision I've ever made. Story 14. We had been together for 4 years when everything fell apart. It started slowly. At first, there were small disagreements, then bigger arguments, and eventually, we were fighting constantly. I knew things weren't great, but I didn't realize just how bad it had gotten until I started noticing a pattern in our fights. It wasn't the issues that were the problem, it was the way we communicated about them. We would argue, and instead of trying to resolve the issue, we would both get defensive and shut down. I would try to explain my point of view, but he would interrupt or dismiss my feelings. Every argument felt like an attack on each other rather than an opportunity to understand each other better. We weren't listening, we were just waiting for our turn to talk. I tried everything I could think of to fix it. I suggested couples therapy, I tried to be more patient, but nothing worked. The more we fought, the more distant we became. The emotional connection we once shared felt like it was slipping away, and I realized I was holding on to something that wasn't there anymore. The breaking point came one evening after another argument. We had yelled at each other for hours, and I was mentally and emotionally exhausted. I sat down, looked at him, and realized I wasn't in love with him. I wasn't angry or sad, I just felt nothing. And in that moment, I knew that was the end. We both deserved better than a relationship where we couldn't communicate or show each other the love we once had. We broke up that night. It wasn't easy, but it was the right decision. We just couldn't go on pretending that everything was fine when we both knew it wasn't. Story 15. I had always known that relationships take work, but I didn't expect it to be this hard. We had been dating for about 2 years, and I thought everything was going well. We had our disagreements, but they were usually small things, and we always found a way to work through them. That was until I realized that we were stuck in a cycle of constant conflict and miscommunication. It wasn't just about the big issues. It was the little things that added up over time. He would make promises that he didn't keep, like showing up late for plans we had made, or not following through on things he said he would do. It made me feel like I couldn't rely on him, and that hurt. But what really did it was his lack of emotional support. Whenever I had a bad day or needed to talk about something important, he would either brush me off or give me a half-hearted response. It felt like he wasn't invested in me or in us anymore. I tried to communicate my feelings, but every time I did, he would get defensive or tell me I was overreacting. We were caught in a never-ending cycle of me asking for more effort and him dismissing my needs. It became exhausting, and after a while, I felt like I was fighting for the relationship alone. The last straw came when I had an emotional breakdown after a particularly rough week. I needed him to be there, but he was more concerned about his own issues. That was when I knew that things couldn't continue. I needed someone who would be there for me, who would support me through the tough times, not someone who ignored my needs. We broke up that night, and while it was painful, it was the right decision. I realized I deserved a partner who would meet me halfway, someone who was willing to put in the effort to build a healthy, supportive relationship. Story 16. We had been together for almost 2 years when I started to notice the cracks in our relationship. At first, everything was perfect. We were inseparable, talking about our dreams, our future together. But over time, things began to change. It wasn't any single thing that caused the shift. It was the accumulation of many small moments that added up to something much bigger. The first time I noticed it was when I realized I was always the one reaching out. I would text him first, call him first, make plans for us. He would always respond, but there was this underlying sense of him not fully engaging. He'd tell me he was busy, or that he didn't feel like talking. And at first, I believed him. But it became a regular occurrence. I started questioning if he really cared. It wasn't that he didn't love me. He did, in his own way, but I felt like I was constantly the one doing all the emotional labor. After several conversations about how I felt, he promised things would change, but nothing did. I still found myself feeling like I was the only one trying to make things work. I would suggest going out or doing something fun, and more often than not, he'd decline or be indifferent. It wasn't just that he was distant, it was the lack of effort that started to feel like neglect. The tipping point came when I planned a surprise weekend getaway to reconnect. I was so excited to spend quality time together, but when we got there, he seemed uninterested. He spent the entire trip glued to his phone, texting his friends and barely engaging in conversations with me. I realized in that moment that I was fighting to keep a relationship alive with someone who wasn't even meeting me halfway. It wasn't one thing that led to the breakup, it was the realization that we had become strangers to each other. I broke up with him shortly after that trip. It wasn't dramatic. I just told him that I didn't think we were right for each other anymore. It was painful, but I knew deep down that I deserved someone who would make an effort to be emotionally present. Walking away wasn't easy, but it was necessary.